Chapter is the myth of superiority. At the beginning of this chapter, Restall asks the question of why is conquest history so ridden with myths on page 131. And what he quotes an anthropologist who says that we seek to distance ourselves from the history because of the tragedy it contains. And so at a time when, because of the events that are in some ways are still unfolding into our times, we try to distance ourselves from it. And so we create these convenient myths or ways of explaining things. And on page 132, he says that they came up with the simplest trope ever invented, that the outcome was simply based on who was superior, who was destined to do it, and who was not. So the myth of superiority. And then he goes on to talk about the ideas that the Spaniards have, such as their God and superior culture, superior religion, superior weapons, etc. And then at the end, he talks about what he calls his five factors that he says better explains the conquest. I was kind of happy that he only had 5 because this is called the 7 myths of the Spanish conquest. And in chapter 1, he talked about the 7 factors of conquest procedures. And in chapter 4, he talked about the 7 factors of incompleteness. So I was glad we got a 5 here because there were so many 7s. It was about to drive me crazy, like the epigraphs. So we come down to the 5. I used to get really into disease in the old days. Certainly there was a large demographic decline among the indigenous population, something on the order in the first 100 years, it may have been as much as 90%. Restall says that sometimes these diseases would go in advance of the colonizing people. So some people speculate that the Inca king who died of smallpox before the Spaniards even arrived, and thus set up a battle of succession and the subsequent civil war that Pizarro was able to exploit. And so there's no doubt that if the vector of disease had gone the other way, as it did, for example, in Africa, where malaria basically cut the other way toward the Europeans, unless the people who, it's not that malaria wasn't deadly to in the peoples where it was, but there was more resistance there. In the same way, things like smallpox, the Europeans it was still deadly to the Europeans, but they had 2 things. They had resistance, which had been built up over centuries of dying from things like smallpox. And they also knew what to do when you have smallpox come to your town, which is you wall up everything and start burning things, and you basically keep away from anyone who has it. That's why we knew what to do. Once COVID-19 came in, we just started walling up the towns and burning things and keeping away from everybody because of our long experience with smallpox. Whereas in indigenous societies, it was, of course, the thing you did with people who had diseases was you went and cared for them and comforted them, which resulted in more spread. So they developed a resistances and a more ruthless approach to something like smallpox. So disease probably should not be underestimated. None of you chose native disunity. So I will say that this is probably the least noted factor in the conquest, but I would believe it is the most important factor. So I mean, by least known, I think that's the one that people know about the least. It will definitely be phrased that way on the quiz. I won't change that question in any way. It's the thing that nobody really knows about or talks about. I don't like the phrase native disunity. And when I read this book from the first time, I said, no, you shouldn't talk about it this way. You should talk about native political savvy. In other words, they were able in some cases to develop alliances in order to defeat long-held enemies. So if you were under the grip of the Aztec Empire and these new guys come into town, you thought about it and said, hey, this might help us out. Now, whether that worked in the long run can be debated, but a lot of people got a decent amount out of this alliance, maybe not as much as they were hoping sometimes. Certainly, it would have been impossible to accomplish to do the conquest without the importance of native allies. But to phrase it as native disunity, I mean, there's a truth in that in the sense that the Aztec and the Inca empires were not politically consolidated when the Spaniards arrived, and especially the Inca was in an outright civil war. So there was a little bit of disunity there, but I think I think that downplays the extent to which people think about things and may have done things that the Spaniards couldn't have even comprehended. Weaponry. Aha. Just to be clear here, weaponry. Much has been made, this is on page 142, of the 5 military advantages that Spaniards allegedly enjoyed. Guns, steel, horses, war dogs, and the tactical skills anyway. So let's go through, well, no, he says steel was important, that having steel weapons and the experience of them was an important factor. That was important. He says, though, not so much the guns, the horses, or the dogs. First of all, the dogs. I mean, yeah, it sucks to get hunted down by a dog. That is true. And, you know, in some places when people unleash dogs on other people, it's one of the most terrible things I can think of. And being hunted by a dog sucks. However, during the conquest, it does not seem that the dogs were that important. Some people said they were, but there's very little evidence of that. The guns also not so important. They may have had a role here and there, but the problem was the gunpowder. It was very difficult to keep gunpowder dry and to be able to use it. And so Restall says that most of the time they might get one shot off and then they turn it around and start using it as a club instead. So the guns don't seem to be, at least in the phase of the conquest, that important. The horses, everybody loves horses, but according to Restall, the horses weren't that important in the sense that, well, for one thing, Cortés himself loved more to fight on foot. Horses were more of a status symbol. If you were riding a horse, it meant you could buy a horse and that you could feed a horse and then you'd get a better share of the conquest. So people wanted horses, but mainly because they were status symbols. They don't seem to have been a huge factor in the actual war effort. Now, I mean, I guess I would also say that the indigenous peoples adapted pretty quickly to some of these things. So they would steal the horses, they would trip up the horses. Horses became hugely important in the Americas, obviously. In the plains, they got a hold of horses and started trading them in front of the Spaniards. So when the US shows up in the Great Plains, you have indigenous peoples riding horses very well. But during the conquest, they did not seem to be the hugest factor. Steel, true. Now, Restall then pauses and says that, well, I'm not even go into the next two factors yet, because with this trilogy, this threesome of factors, you can explain most everything you need to explain. And so he says that if you just talk about diseases, steel weapons, and native alliances or native allies, if you just take away one of those, then you're probably likely to fail. So if you didn't have one of those things, and then he says something that's really super interesting, quoting the historian Clendenin, what a name. Both Spaniards and natives were aware that the conquest was a close run thing. In other words, that it was something that could have gone either way, that a lot of these battles were not necessarily always going to end in favor of the Spaniards. And he also says something interesting, that the failed expeditions outnumbered successful ones. So we only hear about the successful expeditions because those are the ones that they survived to be able to write about it. But people were always getting sent off to try and conquer other. Oh yeah, you go conquer the Maya. Okay, here I go. And then they either die themselves of disease, because the Europeans did get diseases too, or they can't find a alliance, or they get lost. So there were lots of failures here. And so Restall says that, yeah, in the longer run, they could, on page 144, Spanish steel weapons permitted them to hold out long enough for native allies to save them, while the next wave of epidemic disease disrupted native defenses. So he stops here and says these are his top three. Now, then he goes into the next two. The fourth one nobody chose, which is the culture of war. We talked about this a little bit, maybe hopefully a lot before, that the Spaniards had already developed some of these procedures when they were taking the land and territory back within the Iberian Peninsula from the Islamic Empire. And so the tactics and the ideas about battles and how you fight and who you fight and how to do it were already being developed before they came to the Americas, and then were further developed in the Caribbean before they came into the Aztec and the Inca Empire. And so one of the interesting things is when the Spaniards confront the people in the Aztec Empire, for example, like the Spaniards love to just, if you're gonna kill somebody in a battle, you do it right then and there. But the Aztecs wanted to capture you, take you back, and human sacrifice you later. So for the Aztecs, they thought the Spaniards didn't have any respect for human life because they just kill you on the battlefield. Just that was seen as disrespectful and not part of the war ritual. But for the Spaniards, the Aztecs were disrespectful because they capture you and then kill you later, which seemed to be kind of mean as well. So, I mean, you can argue which one of these is better. Well, it doesn't matter. They're both ridiculous. But, I mean, the thing is that the tactics of killing somebody on the battlefield, right in hand-to-hand combat, probably worked better in terms of the tactics or the culture of war. That said, Restall then goes on to say that in sort of the long run game of this, the tactics may not have been that important. It's not that like indigenous people didn't also try to kill from a distance by using arrows and other things. And they, again, like I said, they adapted their tactics to the invaders fairly quickly. He says something interesting here, though, is that in some ways, the Spaniards had, because it was being fought not on their home territory, it was easier for the Spaniards to prevail. Now, this may seem completely counterintuitive. It does to me at first, because you would think if you're far away from home, you won't know the terrain, you don't know what's going on. And as he says, they have nothing to lose but their lives. And so for me, I'm thinking, well, if I've got nothing to lose but my life, I'm going to be like really into this, where, I mean, I'm not going to want to die because that's all I got. But what he says is interesting, and maybe, once you all have families and houses and stuff, it'll become more apparent. But what he says is the indigenous people not only had to worry about their own lives, they had to worry about their families and their house and their land and what they were going to plant next year. And so they were more willing to sort of negotiate, compromise, try to come to some sort of solution. Whereas, the Spaniards didn't have to. They were only going to lose their own life. They didn't have to sort of bargain for somebody else's life. So it's an interesting point about, what you would do in the Americas. His final point number 5, is the age of expansion. I don't know if I've ever completely understood, but I tried again this time. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is perhaps, it's a little more difficult to define perhaps in the weaponry and things that are sort of more close up. I mean, one of the things that Restall says here is that this, if you put the age of expansion actually was going on when outside of Spain. And so I think it's important to talk about this because we often think of this as about the time of the Spanish expansion, or Western Europe, but he says that the age of expansion, this is on page 145, began with the rise of empires outside Europe, with the Mexica fanning out across Mesoamerica and the Inca dominating the Andes. So you already had these American empires. And in West Africa, with the rise of the Songhai Empire from the ashes of that of Mali. In Europe, the Ottomans and the Muscovites, those are from Moscow, began empire building before the Spaniards. And they're still trying to do that, as we've seen recently, as did the Portuguese, who beat their Iberian neighbors in the race for a sea route to East Asia. So in some ways, when the Spain comes in there and the Spaniards come in, they are trying to catch up to these already existing empires. They probably thought they were behind and they had to, get excited. And as we'll read in the next book, it is actually the eventual discovery of this silver, which enables them to feel like they kind of won. But in these initial stages, they felt like they needed to catch up. So for Restall, he calls this, if we look at it in looking at it in the human history over thousands of years, the Spanish conquest is a mere episode in the globalization of access to resources. So it's an interesting perspective that kind of takes us into this larger, grand sweep of history, and maybe does help to explain why people brought this particularly lethal combination of efforts into the New World. As is often the case, we always want to ask, so what, or who cares, or why should we be thinking about the details of this? And I think we've talked about this before, is that, when we think back to the last 500 years, which are really a very peculiar time in human history, it's one of the few times that places outside of Asia are this turn to be perhaps the center of world history for a while. It's the ideas that we have about this conquest and these initial episodes are crucial to what we think about the last 500 years as well. And certainly the idea of superiority, it often comes across, as Restall says, it's like, just the weapons then become a metaphor, an analogy for the idea that if you have superior technology, that means you must be superior in terms of your development and all of those things. And the idea that the people outside of the West were kind of in this state of being evil, being savage, or on the other hand, which is the opposite side of that stereotype, are these noble savages who cry every time a piece of garbage is thrown on the ground or something and are so much better than us, or as lacking in culture at all. And of course, the other side of superiority is the idea of inferiority, or the idea that if you are an indigenous person, then you're destined to disappear from the stage of human history, which we talked about as one of the so what's about how we treat and understand native or indigenous peoples today. So this is an attempt to kind of put it into bigger, what Restall calls in the afterword, the why, making it matter, or what should we, why should we learn this? Why should we think about it? In the afterword, Restall revisits some of these things. He revisits his final five, and he says that if he had to rewrite the thing, that he actually would have begun with the indigenous roles and alliances. Just like I said, that he wouldn't have called it native disunity, he would have called it indigenous alliances and indigenous roles. He thinks that was probably should have been his number one factor. And in part, this reflects something that we've learned in the last 20 years or so, or perhaps relearned, that the diseases were important, but they were probably more important not during the initial conquest battles, but in the aftermath of that. And so even when you read those descriptions of the siege of Tenochtitlan and the disease and how they're walking over these bodies, you have to remember that they were also starving. They were being starved and cut off from their food supplies. So whether they got diseases or not may not have been as important as being starved. So what recent scholars have argued is that the spread of disease would not have been nearly as bad if it wouldn't have been for the atrocities and enslavement committed during and after the conquest. But the disease wasn't itself as much of a factor in the conquest. And even the idea that the diseases spread in front of the Spaniards, in some cases that was true, but it's now being debated whether that Inca emperor actually died of smallpox. Maybe, but there doesn't seem to have been a kind of plague or disease that flowed through there before the Spaniards came. We think that if there would have been, it would have showed up in the accounts at the time, and they were keeping records, and there doesn't seem to be a big demographic decline before the conquest. He says that he would have put steel into the context of the whole technology of warfare, which the Spaniards had been developing. And so, including the seafaring ships and stuff. And so that he would, it may not have been the steel itself, but the whole kind of package of technology which was being brought, which was related to what he says he understated a little bit. He should have emphasized more the culture of war. And so in your book, I've just pulled out a huge quote from there. Bear with me. He says that, and this probably relates, I think, to the kinds of things that Marcus and David were talking about, is that there's a hemispheric clash, right? So between this idea that the Spaniards were developing, which was starting to develop ideas of the total war and motivated by ideologies of racism. So that in some ways, this culture of war, which we might say is part of the age of expansion, is, in Restall's opinion, he understated that toward the end, that he should have perhaps said a little bit more about it in the end. And I guess the other thing that it kind of interests me about the age of expansion, and this is simply to think about, if we're thinking about thousands of years of human history, is that I wonder, in the very last page, Restall says that we are still living through the long period of the uneven encounters, so which would mean that we're kind of in the age of expansion. And I have to wonder if we still are. Or what will we look back on this if we're now looking back on this from 500 years? What will people think of in 2500 when they look back upon us? Are we still expanding, or has the expansion, I don't know, PowerPoint gave me this thermometer to play with. I didn't even ask for it, but I guess it's trying to tell me, hey dude, think about global warming, because 2,500 years or 500 years from now, boy, it's going to be hot out there. I don't know. So I don't know. We may want to enter an age of contraction. We might want to slow things down a little bit. Too much expansion going on.